Midnight, October 25, 1944. No moon, almost no visibility. Only black water ahead. Aboard the bridge of the battleship Yamashiro, Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura studies a report passed to him by his communications officer. American warships have been detected at the northern end of Surigao Strait. PT boats, destroyers, perhaps more. The intelligence is fragmentary. The conclusion, however, is unmistakable. The enemy is waiting. Nishimura reads the report. He passes it to his flag captain without comment. He does not alter course. He does not reduce speed. He does not signal the combined fleet for revised instructions. The column continues north at 18 knots into the narrowest section of the strait. 7 ships, 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, 4 destroyers, moving directly toward the largest concentration of American naval gunfire ever assembled against a single target. 46 minutes after the first torpedo strikes the Fuso, 4,000 Japanese sailors will be dead. The Yamashiro will be capsized and sinking, her starboard rail touching the water, her surviving crew scrambling up the hull toward a sea that offers no exit. The last battleship versus battleship engagement in the history of naval warfare will be over. Nishimura knows what is waiting. He has been told, he has acknowledged the report. He keeps going. The Battle of Surigao Strait was not an isolated engagement. It was the southern prong of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in human history. 4 separate actions fought across more than 100,000 square miles of Philippine waters between October 23 and October 26, 1944. To understand why Nishimura sailed into a strait he knew was an ambush, the condition of the Imperial Japanese Navy by the autumn of 1944 must be understood first. It was not the Navy that had struck Pearl Harbor in December 1941. It was not the Navy that had swept the British from the Indian Ocean or driven the Americans from the Philippines. It was a fleet in the terminal stages of collapse, still dangerous, still capable of inflicting catastrophic damage, but no longer capable of winning a war. The carrier force was gone. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots, had destroyed the last functioning Japanese carrier air groups. 3 Japanese carriers had been sunk. More than 400 aircraft had been lost. The pilots who had survived Coral Sea, Midway, and the Solomon Islands campaigns, the irreplaceable veterans whose skill had terrified Allied naval commanders in 1942, were dead. Their replacements had received a fraction of the flight training. Many could take off. Few could land on a carrier deck. Fewer still could hit a maneuvering target under combat conditions. The fuel situation was catastrophic. American submarines had reduced Japanese merchant shipping to less than half its pre-war capacity. The tanker fleet that moved oil from the Dutch East Indies to the home islands had been hunted almost to extinction. By October 1944, the combined fleet could no longer operate from Japanese home waters because the fuel required to train crews to conduct maneuvers, to steam to battle was no longer available. The fleet had been divided. Its heavy surface units had been moved south to Linga Roads near Singapore, where fuel from the Sumatran oil fields was still accessible without a vulnerable tanker voyage through submarine-infested waters. This division made strategic coordination nearly impossible. Admiral Suemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet, directed operations from a headquarters near Tokyo. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's remaining carriers, now almost entirely without aircraft, waited in the inland sea. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's battleships and cruisers, the first striking force, trained at Linga. The distances between these commands, across seas patrolled by American submarines, meant that any coordinated operation required weeks of planning and depended on reliable communications that the Japanese no longer possessed, and now the Americans were landing on Leyte. On October 20, 1944, the Sixth Army under General Walter Kruger went ashore on the eastern coast of Leyte Island in the central Philippines. More than 700 American ships supported the landings. General Douglas MacArthur, fulfilling his promise to return to the Philippines, waded ashore at Red Beach and broadcast the words that would become immortal. "People of the Philippines, I have returned." The strategic implications of the Leyte landings were not lost on Japanese naval command. If the Americans consolidated their position in the Philippines, they would sever the sea lanes between Japan and the Dutch East Indies entirely. The fleet at Linga would be cut off from its fuel. The home islands would be starved of oil, rubber, rice, everything that made industrial warfare possible. Japan would not need to be invaded to be defeated, it would simply cease to function. The Imperial Japanese Navy had to respond. The question was, how? The plan that emerged from Imperial General Headquarters was called Sho-Go, Operation Victory. It was not a plan designed to win a battle in the conventional sense. It was a plan designed to inflict such catastrophic damage on the American landing fleet at Leyte Gulf that the invasion would fail, or at minimum be delayed long enough for Japan to negotiate some form of acceptable settlement before the home islands were invaded. The ships that executed Sho-Go were not expected to survive. The operation was, in every respect that mattered, a suicide mission with strategic objectives. The architecture of Sho-Go reflected the desperation of its authors. Because the combined fleet could no longer mass its forces due to the fuel crisis, the plan divided the available ships into 3 separate forces that would converge on Leyte Gulf from 3 different directions simultaneously. The Northern Force, Vice Admiral Ozawa's carrier fleet, would sail south from the inland sea and position itself off Cape Engano on Luzon's northern coast. Its role was deception. Ozawa possessed 4 carriers but fewer than 100 aircraft between them. The carriers were bait. Their purpose was to draw Admiral William Halsey's powerful Third Fleet, the American fast carrier force that had been destroying Japanese air power across the Pacific for 2 years, away from Leyte Gulf. If Ozawa succeeded, Halsey would chase the empty carriers north, and the San Bernardino Strait, the northern entrance to Leyte Gulf, would be left unguarded. The center force, Vice Admiral Kurita's first striking force, was the main attack. 5 battleships, including the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, the largest warships ever constructed. 12 cruisers, 15 destroyers. Kurita would sail from Linga Roads, pass through the Sibuyan Sea, transit the San Bernardino Strait during the night of October 24th, and arrive off Leyte Gulf at dawn on October 25th. If Ozawa had succeeded in drawing Halsey north, Kurita would find the American landing fleet almost defenseless. Transports, cargo ships, landing craft, all the soft, vulnerable infrastructure of an amphibious invasion, and destroy it with his battleship's massive guns. The Southern Force, divided into 2 sections under the overall command of Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, would approach Leyte Gulf from the south through Surigao Strait. Nishimura's section consisted of the battleships Yamashiro and Fuso, the heavy cruiser Mogami, and 4 destroyers. A second section under Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima would follow with 3 cruisers and 4 destroyers. Together, they would enter Leyte Gulf from the south at dawn on October 25th. Coordinated with Kurita's arrival from the north, the 2 forces would converge on the American anchorage simultaneously. On paper, Sho-Go was audacious. In execution, it was doomed from the start, because the Americans knew it was coming. By October 1944, American signals intelligence had penetrated Japanese naval codes to a degree that Japanese commanders could not have imagined. The combined fleet's operational orders, its routing instructions, its timetable, all were being read by American intelligence analysts at Pearl Harbor and passed to Admiral Nimitz and Admiral Halsey before Japanese task force commanders received them. The Americans knew what was coming. They knew from which directions. They knew when. And in the path of Nishimura's southern force, at the northern end of Surigao Strait, Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf had 24 hours to prepare a reception. Rear Admiral Jesse Barrett Oldendorf was 57 years old. He had spent 35 years in the United States Navy. He had never commanded a major fleet engagement. His assignment at Leyte was to command the bombardment and fire support group, the older battleships, cruisers, and destroyers assigned to provide naval gunfire support for the troops ashore. These were not the ships of Halsey's fast carrier forces. They were not designed for speed. They were not equipped with the latest fire control systems. Several of them had been pulled from the mud of Pearl Harbor 3 years earlier and painstakingly rebuilt. Now, Oldendorf was being told that a Japanese battleship force was approaching his position from the south, and that it was his responsibility to stop it. He had 24 hours. He used them to build a killing machine. The force Oldendorf assembled was, by any measure, extraordinary. 6 battleships: the West Virginia, the Maryland, the Mississippi, the Tennessee, the California, the Pennsylvania. 5 of the 6 had been present at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The West Virginia had taken 7 torpedoes and 2 bombs at her berth on Battleship Row. She had settled into the harbor mud with her flag flying and more than 100 of her crew dead inside her hull. She had been raised, refloated, repaired at Puget Sound, and completely modernized. New radar, new fire control systems, new anti-aircraft batteries. She was, by October 1944, one of the most advanced gunnery platforms in any navy. The California had been sunk at her berth. The Tennessee had been trapped against her mooring by the sunken West Virginia. The Maryland had taken 2 bombs. The Pennsylvania had been in dry dock, hit by a bomb that killed 15 men. Now all 5 of them were anchored in a line across the northern end of Surigao Strait. Their guns trained south, their fire control radars warming, their crews, many of whom had been aboard on December 7th, waiting for a Japanese fleet to come within range. Something beyond tactics was at work in Surigao Strait that night. The men on those battleships had waited 3 years. They had trained. They had rebuilt. They had watched faster ships and newer carriers carry the war across the Pacific, while they escorted convoys and bombarded shore positions. Now the enemy was coming to them, coming through a narrow strait in the darkness, in column, in exactly the formation that was most vulnerable to the guns of a battle line anchored across its path. The tactical geometry was perfect. Oldendorf placed 4 heavy cruisers and 4 light cruisers on the flanks of the battleship line, extending the wall of gunfire outward so that no Japanese ship could escape to either side. He positioned 2 squadrons of destroyers, 21 ships, along the edges of the strait to deliver torpedo attacks as the Japanese column passed through. He deployed 39 PT boats in 3 groups at the southern entrance to the strait, not to destroy the Japanese force, but to report its position, to harass it, to force it to maneuver, and to buy time. He did not design a battle. He designed an execution. At the southern entrance to Surigao Strait, the water narrows to roughly 12 miles wide. At the northern end, where Oldendorf positioned his battleships, the navigable channel is less than 8 miles across. A Japanese column entering this strait would be channeled into a progressively narrowing funnel, with no room to maneuver, no room to evade, and, critically, no ability to bring more than its lead ship's forward guns to bear against the American line ahead. This was the crossing of the T, the most devastating tactical geometry in naval warfare, a formation that naval commanders had dreamed of achieving for centuries. Oldendorf had not stumbled into it. He had built it. The only question was whether Nishimura would enter the strait. Nishimura had been warned. At approximately 6:30 in the evening of October 24th, a reconnaissance aircraft from the Japanese Army reported American battleships, cruisers, and destroyers positioned at the northern end of Surigao Strait. The report was specific. Nishimura acknowledged it. He forwarded the intelligence to Kurita and to Combined Fleet Headquarters. He did not turn back. The question of why has occupied naval historians for more than 80 years and has never been answered definitively. Nishimura died with his flagship. The documents that might have explained his reasoning, his personal operational orders, his communications with Combined Fleet, his private assessment of the tactical situation, went to the bottom of the strait with the Yamashiro. What remains is inference, reconstructed from surviving Japanese records, from the testimony of the handful of officers pulled from the water, and from the institutional culture of the Imperial Japanese Navy itself. The inference is this: Nishimura kept going because his orders required it. The Sho-Go plan specified that the southern force would arrive at Leyte Gulf at dawn on October 25th, coordinated with Kurita's center force entering from the north. The operational logic was rigid. If either force failed to arrive on schedule, the other would face the full concentration of American naval power alone. Kurita was already under heavy air attack in the Sibuyan Sea. The super battleship Musashi had been hit repeatedly. Kurita had temporarily reversed course. If Nishimura delayed or withdrew, the entire operation would collapse without a shot fired at the American landing fleet. Japanese naval doctrine did not provide flag officers with a mechanism for independent decision-making in these circumstances. The combined fleet expected its commanders to execute their orders. Nishimura had been ordered to be at Leyte Gulf at dawn. He would be at Leyte Gulf at dawn, or he would not return. The first contact between American and Japanese forces came shortly after 10 o'clock on the evening of October 24th. 39 PT boats, small, fast, wooden-hulled craft armed with torpedoes and machine guns, waited in the darkness at the southern approaches to Surigao Strait. They could not sink a battleship. They could not halt a battle line. But they could achieve what Oldendorf needed most: information. Every PT boat that made contact with the Japanese column transmitted a position report by radio. Speed, heading, composition. Every report was forwarded to Oldendorf on the bridge of the heavy cruiser Louisville at the northern end of the strait. Every evasive maneuver the Japanese ships executed to avoid the torpedoes fired at them from the darkness was time they spent not closing the distance to Leyte Gulf. Every minute they maneuvered was a minute Oldendorf's radar operators used to refine their firing solutions. The Japanese crews could see almost nothing. The night was overcast. No moon, no starlight. Japanese optical rangefinders, the best in the world in 1942, were useless in these conditions. The American PT boats used radar. The Japanese ships detected them by the wakes of their torpedoes and the muzzle flashes of their guns. The engagement was not a battle. It was an exercise in prolonged, exhausting asymmetrical harassment, and it lasted for more than 2 hours. By midnight, Nishimura's force had fought its way past the PT boats and entered Surigao Strait proper. Oldendorf had been tracking it for 2 hours. He knew the exact position of every major Japanese ship. He knew their speed. He knew their formation. He had already begun positioning his destroyer squadrons for the torpedo attacks that would open the main engagement. Nishimura, by contrast, knew almost nothing about the force waiting ahead. His reconnaissance had told him American ships were present. It had not told him how many. It had not told him that 6 battleships, 5 of them Pearl Harbor survivors, were anchored in a line, their guns loaded, their radar locked, waiting for him to come within range. The gauntlet had ended. The killing was about to begin. At approximately 3 CET on the morning of October 25th, the first American destroyer attack began. 2 destroyer squadrons, 21 ships, had been positioned on either flank of the strait. Their orders were to engage the Japanese column with torpedoes as it passed, then withdraw at maximum speed. The attack was coordinated so that torpedoes would arrive from multiple directions simultaneously, making evasive maneuvering impossible. The American destroyers were equipped with SG surface search radar, a technology that the Japanese fleet had no equivalent for. On the radar screens aboard the destroyers, the Japanese column appeared as clear, distinct blips, identifiable by size, by speed, by position relative to other ships. The American crews could see the enemy. The Japanese crews could see nothing. The destroyers launched their torpedoes at close range, in some cases less than 5,000 yards, and turned away into the darkness before the Japanese could respond. The torpedoes ran straight and true, and they found their targets. The Fuso was hit first. 2 torpedoes struck the battleship's starboard side. The explosions were visible across the strait, columns of fire and water rising against the blackness. Fuso slowed. She began to list. Her damage control crews fought to contain the flooding, but the damage was catastrophic. Within minutes, the ship was burning forward and settling by the bow. What happened next remains disputed. Japanese and American accounts differ on the exact sequence. What is certain is that Fuso broke in 2. The bow section and the stern section separated and floated independently for some time before sinking. The ship that had launched scout aircraft over Pearl Harbor, that had supported the invasions of the Philippines and Malaya, that had survived 3 years of Pacific combat, came apart in the darkness of Surigao Strait. Of her crew of more than 1,400 men, there were no survivors. 3 destroyers, the Yamagumo, the Michishio, and the Asagumo, were struck by torpedoes in the same attack. The Yamagumo exploded and sank almost immediately. The Michishio, already damaged by earlier air attacks, was blown out of the water. The Asagumo had her bow torn off, but remained afloat, drifting northward, burning, her surviving crew fighting fires in the darkness. Nishimura's force had been reduced by half in less than 30 minutes. One battleship gone, 3 destroyers destroyed or dying. The Mogami, the heavy cruiser, had been hit and was falling out of formation, her steering damaged, her speed dropping. The remaining ships, the Yamashiro, 1 destroyer, continued north. Nishimura was still on the bridge. He had not signaled surrender. He had not signaled retreat. He had not signaled anything at all. At 3:51 in the morning, Oldendorf gave the order. The 6 American battleships, West Virginia, Maryland, Mississippi, Tennessee, California, Pennsylvania, opened fire simultaneously. They were positioned in a line stretching across the full width of the navigable channel. Their guns were trained south, where the Yamashiro was emerging from the darkness, illuminated by the fires of her own burning escorts. What followed was not a battle. It was a gunnery exercise. The American battleships were equipped with Mark 8 fire control radar, a system that could detect a target, range it, compute a firing solution, and adjust for fall of shot, all in complete darkness. The West Virginia's radar locked onto the Yamashiro at approximately 18,000 yards. Her first salvo, 8 16-inch shells, each weighing more than a ton, was in the air before the Japanese lookouts on the Yamashiro had visually identified the American ships ahead. The West Virginia fired 93 rounds of 16-inch ammunition in less than 15 minutes. The Tennessee fired 69 rounds. The California fired 63 14-inch rounds. The Maryland, whose older fire control radar was blinded by the muzzle flashes of the ships ahead of her, fired 48 rounds by tracking the splashes of the other ships' shells. The Mississippi fired a single full salvo from her 12 14-inch guns, the only salvo she would ever fire in anger at enemy surface ships in her entire wartime service. The Pennsylvania never fired at all. Her older radar could not distinguish the Yamashiro from the splashes and fires around her. She remained in line, her guns loaded, her crew straining to find a target in the darkness. 4 cruisers on the flanks added their own fire. The heavy cruiser Louisville, Oldendorf's flagship, fired 333 8-inch shells. The Portland, the Minneapolis, the Denver, the Columbia, the Phoenix, the Boise. More than 3,000 shells of 8-inch and 6-inch caliber were fired at the Japanese force in those 15 minutes. The cumulative weight of fire was such that American shells were striking the water around the Yamashiro at a rate that made it impossible to distinguish individual shell splashes. The Yamashiro was hit repeatedly. Her forward turrets were destroyed, her superstructure was a mass of flame. Her bridge was struck by multiple shells. Admiral Nishimura was killed at his post. His flag captain assumed command, then was killed. Command passed to a junior officer who, realizing the ship could no longer fight and could no longer flee, ordered the crew to abandon ship. At 4:19 in the morning, the Yamashiro capsized and sank. She went down with most of her crew still aboard, more than 1,400 men, including her admiral, her captain, and her entire command staff. 46 minutes had passed since the first torpedo struck the Fuso. The last battleship engagement in the history of naval warfare was over. The Mogami, burning and barely maneuverable, attempted to retreat south. She collided with the heavy cruiser Nachi from Shima's trailing force in the confusion of the withdrawal. She was finished off by American aircraft the following day. Shima's force, arriving at the strait after Nishimura's destruction was complete, made the only rational decision available. Shima turned back. The southern prong of Sho-Go had been annihilated. The destroyer Shigure was the sole survivor of Nishimura's 7 ships. She had taken a torpedo that failed to explode. She retreated south through the strait, her crew watching the fires of the Fuso, the Yamashiro, the Yamagumo, the Michishio, and the Asagumo burning on the water behind them. She reached Brunei on October 27th. She was torpedoed and sunk by an American submarine 3 months later. The Americans lost 39 men killed, most of them aboard the destroyer Albert W. Grant, which had been struck by both Japanese and American shells in the confusion of the night engagement. hit by friendly fire from the cruiser Denver while attempting to withdraw after her torpedo attack. The Grant's crew saved the ship despite severe flooding and a loss of power. She was the only American ship seriously damaged in the battle. The asymmetry of the casualties is almost incomprehensible. 4,000 Japanese dead, 39 Americans, more than 100 to 1. Ships that had survived Pearl Harbor had traveled 3 years and thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean to arrive at exactly this place, at exactly this time, to fire their guns in anger at the fleet that had attacked them at anchor without warning. The coincidence feels like something a novelist would reject as too contrived. But it happened. It happened in the darkness of Surigao Strait on the morning of October 25, 1944, and there is no surviving Japanese officer who can explain why Nishimura kept going, except for the one reason that explains everything and nothing. He had been given an order, and he followed it. The Battle of Surigao Strait was not the decisive engagement of Leyte Gulf. That distinction belongs to the Battle of Samar, fought later the same morning. Taffy 3's destroyers and escort carriers turning back Kurita's battleships in a display of courage so extreme it defies rational military analysis. That is a separate story, and it will be told. But Surigao Strait is something different. It is the last time in human history that battleships engaged battleships in a line of battle. It is the final act in a form of warfare that had dominated naval strategy for 4 centuries, from the Spanish Armada to Trafalgar to Jutland. After Surigao Strait, the aircraft carrier had supplanted the battleship permanently. No navy would ever again send capital ships into a surface gun engagement against other capital ships. The era had ended. And it ended with a massacre. It ended with radar destroying what human eyes could not see. It ended with Pearl Harbor's ghosts firing their guns in anger for the first and last time. It ended with an admiral who knew the trap existed but could not conceive of a response to his orders other than obedience. 4,000 Japanese sailors died in 46 minutes at Surigao Strait. They died because their fleet had lost the war before they sailed into that strait. They died because American industry, American intelligence, and American technology had already made the outcome inevitable. They died because their admiral kept going when every signal available to him said to turn back. And they died because the men waiting at the northern end of that strait had been preparing for this night for 3 years. If these are the stories that matter to you, the battles that shaped the modern world, told with the weight they deserve, subscribe to WW2 Legacy. New documentaries every week. This is what happened.